Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to yet another episode of the Sussman Original Show. Today, I am joined by one of my best of friends, Matthew Klope. It's a bit more of a sciencey episode, as he's currently a PhD student studying chemical biology, and is also involved in work regarding antimalarials. And I figured he could give us an interesting behind-the-scenes perspective on pharmacology as well as the sciences as they are related to chemical biology. And I was right. So without further ado, on with the interview. Hello and welcome back. So today we've got Matthew Klope on, a very, very good friend of mine. We've been friends since, I don't know. How long has it been now, man?
I
Seventh
think
grade?
since seventh grade, yeah, that would have been at least 12 years, I think.
Yeah,
Yeah.
quite a while. And he's doing some very interesting work, or at least in a field that I know very little about. And so I thought it'd be super fun to have him on. So if you wouldn't mind explaining what you do, maybe a little bit of who you are, what you do.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Thanks for having me on. I'm a chemical biology PhD student at UCSF. So that means is I'm like somewhere between student and professional researcher and not very good at either of those things. But learning how to do both. And it gives some really cool opportunities to be involved in a field that's really expanding rapidly and in a field that, is innovating, I think, in really cool ways. And to be at a place at UC San Francisco where that's happening so clearly is really valuable. So I'm happy to talk about any of that.
Yeah, that'd be awesome. I always like, as I always say, I like to start at the beginning because I'm interested in people's stories and what have you as well. And so, how did you get involved in that? Because it's chemical biology, such kind of a random
Yeah,
thing, and as
it's
a
kind of
kid.
yeah. Well, I knew I kind of wanted to do something sciencey going into college. I always loved thinking that way, solving problems that way, and just the way that was presented. And I wasn't sure what exactly that was going to look like. I thought I kind of want to move into clinical space and pursue something in medicine, but then I took organic chemistry my sophomore year of college, and for a lot of people, that can be like a make or break class, and I was dreading it basically my whole academic career because I anticipated I would have to take it, and I was not looking forward to it. And then I
Yeah.
got in, and I loved it. Something just clicked, and it changed honestly, like the whole way I thought about science, and I was able to view a lot of the courses I was having trouble in through organic chemistry. And there's actually like in just like my academic performance, there's the organic chemistry bump, where as soon as I started taking it, I could start thinking of things through that, and it all made sense. And so I knew that was something I wanted to pursue professionally. I wasn't sure exactly what that was going to look like. There's not like a career in clinical practice. There's a pretty clear pathway, but for something like chemistry and research, there's a lot of different routes you can take. So I took a couple years between undergrad and coming to grad school. I worked in behavioral neuroscience because that was something I was interested in as well. But it was pretty clear from what I did there that my real passion was for chemistry and chemical biology. And so when I interviewed at UCSF, it was, at that point, I had kind of made up my mind that that's what I wanted to do, and I've loved it ever since.
Yeah, that's awesome. What are some of the like different, I guess, career paths that are available to someone interested in chemical biology?
Yeah, and this is kind of the case for PhDs in science in general, in fields like biology and chemistry. It used to be the case in like the early 20th century and like the 1950s and 60s that if you got a PhD in a science, you were basically going to become a professor. That's what you were going to do. But these days, there's actually a lot of options, and I think people going on the professor track are actually the minority these days. But I might be wrong about that. Somebody run the numbers on that.
Yeah, yeah, that
But
sounds about right.
yeah, obviously something like professor position is pretty typical for a doctorate, and that can either be teaching or research or both. So a lot of professors will be teaching and running their own research labs at the same time, and that can be difficult. That has a lot of its own responsibilities, but it gives you a lot of freedom to really explore the things you want to explore. And of course, there's industry, things like drug development, and finding scientific pursuits that have some sort of economic impact. So they have some market incentive. Obviously, you're a little more restricted in the kind of thing you can pursue in that, but it appeals to me because I it makes more sense to me to kind of be answering to a market pressure than it does kind of a innovation pressure.
Yeah, yeah.
There's both in each, but I don't know. I feel more comfortable selling things to a public than I do selling it to a government or a funding agency. They can be pretty fickle.
Yeah, yeah.
Uh, and then there's other things like science communication. Obviously, there's a lot of really cool work going into that. Even on YouTube, there's a lot of really talented science communicators.
Mm-hmm.
And things like policy making and legislation and forming governments, and
Yeah.
the opportunities these days are really plentiful.
Yeah, that's one that I hadn't really thought about, but like science communications, because I mean you can pretty much everyone I feel like can think of a few large name people, whether it's like your Neil deGrasse Tysons or whatnot, who are, I mean, basically teachers to the public almost.
Yeah,
But
and it's a really valuable skill set because a lot of what happens inside the industry is so industry specific and it's so inundated with these really technical terms. It's really hard to digest, even for me. And so when you have an expert in it that's able to really synthesize that and put that into words that a general public can understand, that's an incredibly valuable skill because then we're all on the same page on the kind of developments that are happening and how we can all invest in it together.
yeah, that's awesome. Uh, yeah, and I feel like now is such an interesting time with the rapid growth of technology and the rate at which it's improving and how it's changing every single industry. But have you noticed anything like that in your field?
Well, absolutely. It'd be hard to ignore CRISPR. I mean, that's making
it,
right? And just for a review for your viewers, it's essentially a gene editing paradigm that allows for far more selective gene insertions and deletions and just toying with genetic material than can ever really be achieved before. And so now a lot of things like embryonic development, I think that's the main one on people's minds right now, but also like probing disease and probing health and how we start to synthesize those things. A lot of opportunities are available now that were not available before, and so people are able to think in those spaces, and it obviously has a lot of ethical implications.
Yeah,
that's where a lot of the conversation is going now. But there's a lot, that's happening at lower levels than that. Things as simple as like if I want to validate a target in a cell, I have a much easier way to do that now because now I can like knock it down or I can turn it on and turn it up and see what happens.
And you use that for what exactly when you do that?
Well, you can apply that to a lot of things. I think some of the cooler things it gets applied to is targets that are hard to hit by traditional therapeutics. Like you think of a traditional therapy maybe like a small molecule, like an aspirin or ibuprofen or something like that. What it's doing is it's binding to a particular target. So you have a protein maybe that you're trying to hit, and by hitting it, you're inhibiting it, and by inhibiting it, you're ameliorating some sort of disease. It can be hard to hit some proteins. Some proteins don't have really good spots that a small molecule can bind to. And so sometimes if you just want to get a feel for whether hitting that target is going to affect the disease outcome, hitting it on a genetic level is far easier. Because if you can just knock out the gene that's creating the target, and then that is eliminating the disease, all of a sudden you have a really good idea of, okay, if I find a way to hit this, I can have a pretty good effect on the disease state.
Yeah, it's like going one level deeper, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's really valuable as a research tool. And past that, the routes that people are taking for CRISPR and the things that are being inserted for it are, science fiction.
Yeah.
Yeah,
that's crazy. I'd love to talk about CRISPR for a moment too, because it's such a interesting topic that I feel like the general public is starting to gain more and more awareness of, or at least the terminology, but there's still a lot of like things that are unclear. What is science fiction and what is possibilities at this point? How? Let me just think how to put that. But what are some of the discussions going on around that in your field? I know we just touched on some of those, but like,
we might all remember the gene-edited babies out of China.
Yes, we just recently had those were the first official, I guess.
Yeah.
Unofficial. The first unofficial human trials.
modified by CRISPR therapy, and it's generally agreed across the field, and I think everybody's got a pretty good feel for this, that was not the right time, place, method,
Yeah.
way of doing science. That was just wrong. But there are interesting ways that we can actually start to enter that space. A lot of the objections that people in the field had to applying CRISPR to something like what he applied it to.
And that was for removing what was that again? What did he end up doing?
I believe, if I remember correctly, he was hitting CCR5, which is a certain surface protein on your immune cells that HIV uses to invade and to propagate.
Yeah.
And there's some genetic evidence from people who have a deletion in CCR5 that it has a protective effect against HIV infection. And so he took two children whose fathers had HIV, and he tried, we'll get into that later, to knock down CCR5 so that they had a lower risk of getting transmission of HIV from their dad. A lot wrong with what just happened.
Okay, yeah.
The first one is that he didn't do it right. There's some genetic evidence that's coming out that he actually didn't delete CCR5 in the ways that we see it deleted in something like a knockout human. He truncated some of them, but some of them he lengthened, which is dramatic. The effect that that's going to have is really unclear. He also took a significant risk on perturbing a system that doesn't have a significant associated risk with itself. So he took a really risky play, solving a problem that probably wasn't going to be a problem, because transmission rates from a father to a daughter are very low. Something like a mother to a child is much higher. And that's another conversation people have been having around this. But I think the biggest thing is nobody really understands, when you put this on a human system, what kind of global effects you're going to have. Because CRISPR is fairly well targeted, but it's not perfect. And there's emerging evidence that it causes some pretty significant global deletions and insertions, or it can, that are hard to detect, by traditional means. And so
using it can often have unintended consequences, but it's not even known to what extent those consequences.
Yeah, so you could be trying to hit gene A and inadvertently hitting gene Y and gene X and gene Z and not really realize it. And when you're doing that in the human, those could be very important genes. And now you're putting it in a system where these humans might be having children, they might be propagating these genes downstream, and you might be creating a novel genetic disorder. It's pretty irresponsible.
Yeah, well, that definitely puts some of the dangers into light, I feel like. When
you're working with genetic material, you have to realize the permanence of what you're doing. And there are ways to do CRISPR where it's impermanent, but he did not do that. So.
Yeah. What was the general reaction like to from the scientific community, at least that you noticed when you first heard about that?
Absolute shock.
Really? Yeah.
I think it mirrored the general public of just, oh my God, no. This was too soon. This was misguided. This was not the time, the place. Yeah, he's in some deep doo doo.
Yeah,
I think he's on house arrest in China right now. So, oof.
Not a great place you want to be in trouble in.
No, certainly not. Yeah.
And then on the other side of things, though, what are some of the potential positive applications that you guys are looking forward to, perhaps near term or maybe a little further out with CRISPR that excites you?
Near-term target validation is a big one for the kind of work we do. It makes it really easy to ask and answer questions quickly so that we're able to pursue pathways that are probably going to be productive. Because we might spend a long time trying to probe a system before we ever get anywhere near to treating it or finding a pathway to improving health or to overcoming disease.
And by that you mean it's almost like preparing an area before you're actually able to do the work?
Yeah, what would be a good metaphor for that? It's kind of like testing the waters before you really invest. With something like drug discovery and with therapeutic development, you want to fail early. It's very similar to the whole Silicon Valley mindset in that way. Yeah. Because the longer and deeper you go, the more you've invested and the more you stand to lose. And so if you can get your negative early, that's great. And what CRISPR allows you to do is to really get some difficult questions out of the way early. So like, let's say I think protein A has a pretty significant role in disease A. And there's some evidence for it, but it's not a clear way. But what I might have done in the past is found a way, like I mentioned, to take a small molecule or maybe an antibody or something, put it in like a cellular or a mouse disease model and hit protein A and see if I have any effect on the disease. That can be difficult. Small molecules aren't trivial. But if you have the genetics, CRISPR can be fairly trivial, and I don't want to speak too much. There's some people out there that would get mad at me for saying that. But it can be easier, certainly, than finding a good chemical probe, certainly. And if you take that genetic component, and now I can knock down genetically protein A and see the effect it has on disease A, I get a clear picture of whether protein A is something worth pursuing. So that's one application in kind of my arena that's helpful. It's sort of niche, but it's cool. Mm-hmm. Another one is disease models. So you're probably familiar, scientists use a lot of like rodent and even higher primate and dog disease models. We don't love it, but it's something we have to do sometimes.
CRISPR beats human testing.
Yes, certainly. And that's the main thing. And what it allows us to do is really perturb those genetics much quicker, much more humanely, and in a much more controlled fashion. So CRISPR is going to open up a lot of new disease model pathways as well. And then there's also like the pie-in-the-sky dream of this somehow being applied to human disease. I don't think it's there quite yet, but that's something in the next like even decade that'll probably be talked about much more. There's already a few projects right now that look much stronger than the one that went on in China, that could potentially get okayed. Like things for horrible genetic diseases that are basically death sentences. And if you can target it at the embryonic level and use CRISPR to fix these genetic deficits, all of a sudden you've changed a life. And that's the really exciting component of CRISPR.
Yeah, and so for something like CRISPR, it's mostly used at incredibly early stages of development, right? So, yeah.
I think right now that's where the focus is. It's being used in so many applications that it's kind of hard to speak to, but I think a lot of the excitement is for this kind of early embryonic intervention, where let's say this embryo has Huntington's, but all of a sudden you can knock out that Huntington repeat and bada bing, bada boom, they're not going to get Huntington's disease. And that's big. Like, that's huge. Yeah. That's exciting. Yeah. And I think there's later adult applications, but there's a level of familiarity that I lack.
Yeah. No, that's really, I mean, that's huge, though. That is really exciting.
Yeah, it's cool. And then there's also, like, just really cool, more niche stuff. There's a guy at UCSF who's using CRISPR, kind of a CRISPR system, to record information over time in a cellular context. So cellular development can be something that's hard to see because they, brain cells develop in a brain.
Yeah,
it can be hard to take pictures of those. But you can use CRISPR as kind of a record-keeping device for certain biomarkers you're looking at, and get a really cool temporally resolved picture of cellular development, which can potentially be really helpful for something like autism that's happening even at like the embryonic level.
Yeah, that is really cool. And so, obviously CRISPR is kind of one of the biggest hot topics in terms of, I feel like, tech, but is there anything else in technology-wise that is really exciting that maybe is getting overshadowed or whatnot?
Yeah, absolutely, there is. I think Francis Arnold's work with enzyme evolution, it certainly got
recognized. Get a Nobel Prize?
Nobel Prize, yeah. Yeah, but I think it didn't quite grab the mainstream headlines the way CRISPR has, and I think it's equally as cool. And what she's essentially doing is, if we think about evolution in like a biological context, what it's doing is it's creating large changes by creating a series of really small changes. So instead of like jumping from A to Z, it's going from A to B to C to Z. It tends to make small amino acid substitutions or transversions or transitions. It basically takes small steps to achieving these broader functions. And what Francis Arnold asks is like, we know enzymes, these proteins that catalyze certain reactions, are much better at what they do than the kind of things we try to do in like a synthetic chemistry lab. There's some enzymes we can never beat. The problem is biology has evolved pretty, selectively for certain kinds of chemistry that we might not be interested in. And if biology is interested in this, we tend to be interested in that. And so enzymatic chemistry can really only help us with the things that it's been evolved to do. And so if we're trying to do a chemical reaction that biology has never had to think about, we're not going to really have any help there until Francis Arnold starts thinking like, well, what if we got something that wasn't quite here, but was close? And what if we start mutating that to see if we can get it closer? And through these successive rounds of mutation and selection, they get closer and closer and closer until all of a sudden they have an enzyme that's performing a chemistry that's really, really hard for us to perform in lab. And it's just cranking it out because the biology is really well adapted to that. And that's exciting because it's going to open a lot of opportunities for generating molecular entities that have been traditionally, off limits or, prohibitively expensive or time consuming to do. And what that could do is move back into therapeutic space, and potentially we'd have some drugs that, we just couldn't have before.
Okay, yeah, so it's like a incremental, rapid almost advancement of, I guess, drugs being the end goal of pharmaceuticals.
Yeah, drugs for me is kind of what comes back to that. It's the endpoint for me, but there's a lot of applications for that. It's directed evolution of just novel chemical space and chemical matter that biology hasn't explored, but that we're pushing it towards. Which is really exciting. She's given some really good talks. I'm sure there's some online, so anyone who's watching, I would encourage you to watch those.
Francis Arnold.
Yeah, Francis Arnold. Francis with an E. And she's one of those people that's really good at taking this high-level industrial stuff and synthesizing in a way that's really consumable for everyone. She gave one of the best talks I've seen where like a 50-year professor and a brand new chemical biologist could sit in the same room and both get a lot out of the talk, which is a really incredible skill set.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah. And then one thing that I'm personally always kind of interested in, as someone who's intrigued by programming and has been dabbling in it, I've been hearing, how has that been getting implemented on the science side of things? Because you would think that it doesn't seem like a normal fit necessarily.
Oh, it's huge. So if we think about, I don't know how much you've tried to read like scientific literature, but it can be a slog. It can, because these papers tend to be highly specific in a highly specific area. Obviously, there's some groundbreaking, like landmark ones that are just huge, but a lot of them are like a subunit B of protein A looks like this and does this, and to synthesize all this in your brain and to find these connections between these incredibly disparate papers is just not what the human brain was designed to do. One of the more exciting things that I think that programming and AI has been used and leveraged towards is mining scientific literature, because it can understand and it can synthesize that level of information to find new connections that we might not be able to see. And there's some really cool stuff going on where people have, blinded computers to certain developments, like in the past, and then feeding them literature, like contemporary literature surrounding those developments. The machines have been able to predict them. So like if I left CRISPR out of my machine learning algorithm and then I fed it a lot of genetic data and information, what it essentially says is if I make a really good machine learning algorithm, it might be able to predict CRISPR as a genetic entity. And going forward, the idea is that it might be able to mine these like millions of scientific papers and predict certain outcomes and things and see connections that would literally be impossible for anyone to see, even these geniuses around here. That's a powerful way that, programming is changing it. On a much lower level, they're having us learn Python, which is really valuable. I think these days, most industries, programming is a really valuable skill set to have. It helps you to think in certain ways at a basic level, and then it also it enables you to solve problems you might not anticipate could be coded, and then all of a sudden you're looking at it and you're like, wait a minute, I could code this and it'd make my life easier.
I don't have to spend forever trying to do this by hand.
Yeah, I've already experienced that a few times, and so it opens a lot of doors that way.
What are some of the things you use it for personally?
Well, I did some rotations in like genetic analysis, and so it's really good at kind of taking complex, broad genetic data and pulling out things that I might be interested in. And so we can tool Python scripts to scan certain regions of DNA and like these millions of bases long, and to pull out things that look like something we might be interested in. And by going through those, we can say, oh, this is something I'm interested in. Thank you, Python script. And then not something that I worked on, but something I had the opportunity to like use, which was probably one of the cooler things, was right when we started. There's a lot of really cool work going on in computational docking at UCSF.
And what does that mean?
Yeah, so you might have heard of something called a high throughput screen. What it essentially is I've mentioned like protein targets are a common way that drugs are developed. So you'd take your protein target, you'd put it in like like 1,000 wells. So you have 1,000 individual wells with your protein, and then you'll take a bunch of molecules you think might hit it, and you'll put one molecule, well, a lot of that one molecule, you understand.
Yeah.
In those wells and see if you're hitting it, and have some kind of readout that shows you which molecules are doing well, which molecules are doing poorly, and then you can pull out the ones that are doing well and maybe tool those into something like a therapeutic. The problem is, like, the theoretical chemical space that looks like a drug, like, basically expands past the number of atoms in the known universe. The potential of chemical matter is mind-bogglingly large. So you'd never be able to reach anywhere near it, like your orders of magnitude off in something like a high-throughput screen where you have to put in your molecule into the well, because you're always going to be limited by these mechanical processes, by your ability to actually make the compound and put it in. But
if I understand right, so it's like one of the main ways that you're testing these things to see if it works is basically you're trying to figure out if these two things play nicely together, if they connect nicely, and if they do, it works. It's good. But the problem is you're limited by how many tests you can run, basically, when in actuality there is a vast, and so you're kind of just hoping to stumble upon a good one.
The fact that anyone has ever discovered a drug is a miracle, honestly.
Yeah.
Like, if I'm going after if I'm going after a target that looks like this, I can think of a lot of shapes that fit here.
Yeah, like a circle.
Yeah, like a circle. I can think of like infinite shapes that fit here at the end of the day if I make the shape small enough and I start stacking them on top of each other and things like that. And so I'm limited essentially by my ability to make those shapes, my ability to order and buy those shapes, my ability to put them in the thing, the target. What a computational docking does is it models your target in virtual space. And so now, instead of being limited by physical matter, I'm only limited by computational time. So I can take any shape that I can think of making and predictively bind it into that pocket. And through some algorithms that the computer does, it can kind of start to predict, and some of them are very good, whether this binding interaction is meaningful. And then it's going to spit some things out back to me like, hey, you should probably look at this one. This looks good. And then I go buy that one. I test it, and maybe it looks good or not. And these algorithms started off pretty rough.
Yeah.
Yeah, as you might imagine, it's really hard to predict intermolecular interactions at that scale, but they're getting better. And one of the ones that just got run at UCSF, I think of the predicted binders that the computer spat out, something like 30% bound well, which as far as docking campaigns goes, is nuts. Yeah. That's very good, because that's really like minimize the lead time into finding something that might look like a drug. That can be a difficult process. It's certainly not trivial. And so as much help as you can get along the way is really incredible. And so the computational docking in terms of the programming, I think, is certainly one of the big arms right now.
Yeah, it sounds like it's got some pretty massive wide-reaching implications in how much it can help, and especially when it's limited by something like computational time. Well, that's only getting better.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and these libraries keep getting bigger. Like the virtual libraries, they're screening of these molecular entities. I think he's up in the hundreds of millions now.
Jeez, yeah.
That are through this, and you could never do that in physical space. So
yeah,
it's advantageous, certainly. Yeah. It's actually a fun little caveat. I know everybody, well, maybe not in Switzerland, but in America is pretty familiar with the opioid epidemic.
A little bit. Well, hey, we were familiar with it here as well. I believe in the '90s or whatnot, but '70s,
Okay,
'80s,
a little ahead
'90s.
of the curve.
Yeah.
Yeah. One of the problems with opioids is the chemical entity that opioids kind of follow is all very similar across them. I don't really know how to explain it that level. Basically, the shape of all these opioid families is so similar that it's hard to make something that does like the pain-killing effect of opioids and minimizes the addictive effect, because that seems to be a function of this molecular shape.
Yeah, they're connected almost.
Yeah, it's really hard to tease the two apart. And what one of the computational docking guys predicted, Brian Schoikert and John Irwin over at UCSF, they thought, okay, this shape is obviously pretty limited. It's hitting the opioid receptor, but it's causing this addictiveness, this respiratory depression, and this overdose death that can occur. I wonder if there's a way to tease these things apart by finding a new structure. And people have been trying that for a long time. Heroin was actually an attempt at making a less addictive morphine, so imagine that.
It works.
Yeah, they really nailed that one. So, but the long story short, the computational docking predicted a molecule that it said probably hits the opioid receptor really well, but in a way that would minimize the addictant potential. And it's a shape nobody would ever thought of. Essentially.
Like a triangle.
Like a triangle, basically. Everybody's been trying circles. Somebody tries a triangle, and bada boom, it works. And so they're kind of moving forward with this opioid with a far lower addiction threshold, which is a big step forward because chronic pain is a real issue. And so we need something that still solves that problem, but avoids the addiction that you see with opioids, and that's an exciting, kind of output of computational docking.
Yeah, that's fascinating. That is really cool. And just thinking like how many possibilities that can help with. I mean, because you can apply that pretty much anything and everything to make better drugs.
Yeah,
what we have.
that's the idea. And the more these predictions improve, the more things like that will start to come out. Where we thought we were limited shapes or certain binding patterns, all of a sudden these computers might spit out an idea we never would have thought of, and it works, and we can run with that.
Yeah, that's cool. One thing that I've kind of on topic, but something that I find kind of interesting is whenever I'm diving into a new subject or a new topic or learning something new, I've found that it can occasionally affect the way that I think and how I problem solve. And so I'm curious with you as you're learning Python right now and programming and stuff.
Yeah.
Has that affected how you've just your thought process a little bit, or how you tackle some problems?
It's hard to say. It's certainly a lot of computational stuff, like just like manual Excel work I would have been doing by hand. Now that I have ways to script that, it makes my life a lot easier.
Yeah.
There's some like software I use fairly regularly that it's much easier to interface with if I know what the scripts are doing.
Yeah.
So at that level, obviously, it's changed. But I'm sure it's kind of hard to point at how your thinking has changed. I'm sure it has. One of the things, honestly, I've noticed is if I get a little burned out or if I'm a little foggy, sometimes I'll just do like a Python exercise just to get my head back in that space of thinking logically and like completing a task, honestly, so I can jump back into whatever I'm doing with kind of a renewed sense of like flow and focus.
Yeah.
So that's honestly been one of the most helpful things is like when I'm kind of burnt out, I'll go to Python, solve a problem, and get that little dopamine hit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then speaking of the same thing, then going broader, has your time in being immersed in chemical biology and whatnot, how has that affected the way that you just look at the world?
Yeah. Oh boy. How long of an answer do you want on this?
I'm curious, yeah, because I feel like there's a little bit of that going on out in the world. A little bit of biology, a little bit of chemistry.
Well, I in the honor of sounding incredibly pretentious, I minored in philosophy in college.
Yeah.
So I've always enjoyed, thinking about the world in that way. And reductive empiricism and the kind of things we engage in are really illuminating for kind of probing those bigger questions. There's certainly some things they lend themselves to better. Like they don't really answer the whys, but they certainly answer the hows.
Yeah.
And getting an idea of how the world works at a fundamental level is always incredibly illuminating for giving you an appreciation for how it works at a system level for me. Kind of the emergent properties of human behavior and interaction, and how these, chemical interactions and these motions are at a system level, resulting in something like the experience of consciousness, or the way we interact with each other, and the expectations and goals and personalities we have, is fascinating. And just the way that's all stitched together. And that's one of the more rewarding things about it, is to understand that, that at some level we're very much mechanical. And I have a big gripe with the people who think we're only mechanical.
Yeah. What's that?
Well, I think there's something about us that transcends what I would call Brownian motion, which is just like the random movement of particles.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's something in the experience of consciousness that kind of defies empiricism.
Yeah, we're not just hardware.
Exactly.
Got some software in there.
I don't see anything on like the neurotransmitter level that could explain, love.
Yeah.
Just say it really, what's the word I'm looking for? To say a big cliche.
Yeah.
But it's interesting, and I think it's good to challenge the way you think in that way. Anything you jump into and you really start to learn about is going to challenge your thinking, but it's valuable because it makes the worldview you have at the end of the day stronger and more founded in evidence, and just more foundational.
Yeah, it's I don't know, it's a trip when you realize just how complex our bodies are and how complex just normal everyday things are.
Yeah. I'm sure the people over at the neural interface labs have that, spades, because I do not envy their jobs. That the human brain and these neural networks are so mind-bogglingly complex. I don't know how you begin to interface with it. But
Yeah. It's just
there's something pretty beautiful in the way we're stitched together, and so there's always kind of that sense of awe that I don't want to lose, and just learning about that. And having that passion is important in anything you do. I think if I'm handing out my 2 cents of advice to anyone, losing that passion, I think, is the most destructive thing you can do in anything you do. You can pursue a career where you're making money and you're getting acclaim and fame, but if you don't care about it, I don't think you've succeeded at all, regardless of what you accomplish. And so pushing yourself to discover that passion and to keep the things that you're really interested in front of you, and keep those things as things you're chasing and being rewarded by, that's what's going to give you that return. And that's what I've seen in the most successful scientists I've encountered. Is these are people who are getting a return out of what they're doing. They're not doing it for the Nobel Prize. They're getting the Nobel Prize because they did it, because they loved it. So at the end of the day, that's the key.
That's awesome. Yeah. What are some of the things that have surprised you the most, just in your field?
Yeah. Surprised me in what sense?
Let's go with just I had no idea that's how that worked sense, or yeah.
Yeah. There's a funny one. I don't know why this came to my mind first, but sometimes the nomenclature is funny, honestly. There's something called the HERG channel, HERG, and it's kind of a big deal in drug discovery because it's on your heart, and it's promiscuous, so it binds a lot of things, and it kills a lot of drugs because if your compound hits it, it causes cardiac arrest. Oopsie.
Which is bad.
Which is bad, generally speaking.
Heart attacks.
But biologists went through this phase that they're still kind of in, where the nomenclature was just kind of the Wild West. And so they were looking at the fruit fly, and they were doing a genetic knockdown screen. This was pre-CRISPR, so it was really arduous and awful, and I don't want to be involved. But they were knocking down genes and seeing what happened, like I kind of mentioned with the target validation. And they knocked down HERG, and they noticed that these flies, when you kind of gave them ether, went crazy.
Oh.
The phenotype when you knock this gene down was if you apply ether to a hERG knockdown mice, and ether is just this kind of gaseous, fruity anesthetic.
Yeah.
They just go nuts. And so, of course, they named the channel hERG, which stands for Human Ether A Go-Go. but you wouldn't want to, like, if your drug hit the hERG channel and it was causing cardiac arrest in a patient, you wouldn't want to walk up to them and be like, this is happening to you because my drug's hitting your Human Ether A Go-Go channel.
Yeah.
There's like a weird Sonic the Hedgehog fandom is everywhere. There's a weird correlation between some of the really important like developmental proteins in Sonic the Hedgehog, because before someone realized how important it was, they just named like an early embryonic gene Hedgehog, and it turned out to be really important. Hedgehog family of genes, and there's Sonic Hedgehog, and there's all this crap. And like, I go to actual scientific meetings where these actual real scientists are putting like Sonic Hedgehog protein on the thing.
That's so good. So be careful with your names, kids.
Yeah, so that's certainly been a surprise. One of the things, yeah. I could go on all day on that.
So ridiculous. So great, though. Yeah. Yeah, that's crazy. I'm curious, what are some of the biggest, this is a bit of a big question, but what are some of the biggest misconceptions there are with pharmacology and
yeah,
field?
I think there are certainly some bad players. I think the biggest misconception is that the people in drug development are, greedy corporate bastards in it for the money. And I think that's a view a lot of people have. And this kind of goes all over the place. There's extremes to this viewpoint I've encountered.
Some of them are in it for the stocks as well, right?
The liquid.
Yeah.
I've encountered, real human people who have said to me, the government has a cure for cancer that they're not giving us. And it's like, okay.
Yeah.
The government's spending a lot of money on cancer research, so it will behoove them to give us that. But I think, at a base level, we should all at least be able to agree that most people in the drug development industry are good, reasonable, rational people. And I think one thing, obviously, drug prices are a conversation that we need to have, that some of these are getting out of hand. And we also need to kind of have a conversation about what kind of technology we expect to be, readily available right now. And I think that's a lot of what's pushing the financial aspect of it is we're no longer limited by the technologies we can achieve. We're limited in our ability to pay for them. And we have to have an honest conversation about that. But I don't think people have an understanding of the scale of failure on industrial drug development. When you're taking a promising lead from something like a cellular screen, the chances of that failing before it ever sees a human are astronomical. And so anytime a company reports a success, what you have to understand is like there are thousands of failures sitting behind that success that have sucked all that cash down. And like that's a risk these companies are taking, but it's also a risk that's going to, at the end of the day, affect their bottom line.
Yeah, and
so
that's something that, like, I mean, I'll see things that are reported in the news or whatnot. Oh, this thing worked, and it can be easy for me to think, oh, well, okay, what's the big deal? Like, but it makes sense now that you're saying that. Okay, well, they've failed so many times trying to get this one thing to work that
if you see a drug success, that drug started at least 10 years ago, at least. Yeah. And there are a number of drugs in that family and in that target space that they tried that did not work. And if you really dig, you can find them, and it's probably not worth your time. But it's all to say, like, this is a high-risk business, and the prices reflect that in some sense. And there's some bad players, but I think better management of that risk and better expectation and better transparency when setting these prices is certainly much needed.
Yeah.
But I think that's the biggest misconception is people think this is easy, and it's absolutely not.
Yeah, that's cool though. It's definitely puts a different perspective on it. But yeah. What are slightly different question, but What are some cool examples, or have there been any like forms of popular media that you feel like have really nailed or done it right? Because it can be so easy for whether it's movies or whatnot to just make up their own stuff.
I know there are. Let me think for a sec. I feel like I've seen a few lately that were really good. Oh, jeez, I'm drawing a blank. I'm sorry. Just cut the part of me saying.
No. Well, we can start with like say movies or what have you. What are some movies that you've really liked that might have tackled something that in an interesting way?
Oh, what was that one? This is really going to betray how familiar I am with this movie. I think there's been Westworld.
There we go.
I know Westworld. I think Westworld has done a really good job handling the conversation of, and here we're about to get like armchair philosopher again.
Yeah.
Of how much we're mechanical and how much we're, not.
Yeah.
And obviously, they kind of push a perspective that I don't wholly agree with, but it's an interesting one to consider. This idea that we're machines and that we're governed by these same physical properties that govern the things around us. I think there's something more to us than that. But I do really appreciate the artistry of what they've done and the kind of philosophy they've implemented there. I'd recommend that show to anyone. I think the way it makes you think about those.
Except maybe small children.
Yeah, except small children. Or maybe the elderly. They tend to not like that sort of thing. But the way they've handled that conversation is cool, and that's something that I've always been interested in. I like thinking about things in that sense.
Yeah.
And it's been kind of cool to watch that.
That's one of the exciting things about science fiction that I feel like can be easily misunderstood is that the science doesn't have to necessarily all be 100% correct in order for it to tackle complex topics.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think kind of along those lines, shameless plug of a book that came out like 40 years ago, but Breakfast of Champions by Kurt Vonnegut. He was science fiction-y. I think he described himself as a science fiction author.
Yeah.
But he handles that particular question, which again is one that's always interested me in a way that I really love. So that's probably my favorite book, honestly. But I don't know if I'd call it popular media. But obviously, he's a popular author, but I'd recommend that one to anyone too. So.
Yeah, I will definitely check it out. It's been meaning to for a while.
It's a good one. Yeah.
Yeah, that's cool. What are on the other end of the spectrum, what are some tropes that you see a lot that are just false?
Emily, my wife, watches NCIS a lot.
Oh no.
The way they handle forensic science is a little questionable. They do things with a mass spectrometer that I didn't know could be done. And so I think the big trope to me is always like science can answer far more than it can, far shorter time periods and with far less money in any movie ever. There's also the trope of like evil scientists. I don't know if you've been watching Stranger Things.
I need to catch up. I'm a little behind, but yeah.
Yeah, without spoiling anything, there's a lot of evil science that happens in that show. I don't know why scientists are always evil. But here we are. Yeah, so it's like either the evil scientist bent on destroying the world, or it's the scientist who does the impossible easily in like a snap of his fingers.
Yeah.
Yeah. That there's a suspension of disbelief with most of this stuff that I'm willing to do, but the forensic science aspect is a little dicey.
Yeah.
Welcome to NCIS, where the only crime is murder, and where the mass spectrometer can solve everything. Put this dirt in the mass spectrometer, and we can tell you who shot the guy.
Yeah. And where he is now, and all that good stuff. Yeah. Okay. Here's one that's kind of I feel like could be interesting, but like, what's the perspective on things like zombies and whatnot in movies? Because you see, it's come up so much, and it's such a, like, I feel like you could tell an interesting story surrounding that because you've got to get into the virology of it all and what have you.
Yeah.
But yeah,
I don't know if you've heard of toxoplasma.
I have, but I couldn't explain it.
I'm gonna put you on the spot here.
Yeah. No. What is it?
Basically, there are parasitic organisms that are known to change brain chemistry and change behavioral patterns.
Like,
And so it's not a question that a virus or a biological entity could potentially have an effect on behavior. I mean, that's something we see all the time. I think the zombie trope, obviously, having these undead things walking around for months at a time, everything needs energy.
Yeah.
And if something's actively decaying, it's not going to last very long. There are real life examples of like kind of biological zombies. There are parasites that jump into worms or cricket brains and drive them to like jump into pools of water so that the worm can propagate, which is scary.
A little bit, but yeah.
Yeah, but yeah, the zombie element's cool. The way that a parasite and organism could affect human behavior is really interesting. Yeah. I think there's obviously a fascination with that, and with good reason. It's a compelling story.
Yeah, and I mean, having an enemy that looks like us or whatever. But yeah, and I think it's been kind of interesting how it seems like now that genre has been so played out or what have you, we're starting to get variations that in some cases are still a bit of a leap, but might have a little more basis in science or whatnot, whether that's like The Last of Us, which had the cordyceps fungus, I believe, was, or...
I'm not familiar with that one.
Oh, that was the one with the basically, I believe, science could be totally off here, but I believe it was a fungus that would take root in the brain of ants, basically, and it would control them and lead them. I think it would basically lead them up to higher places.
So that they, yeah, that's right. No, there's scary stuff like that. It's nuts. I mean, yeah, there's been a competitive evolution for so long that some of that really spooky stuff happens. But it's cool.
Yeah.
And I think this age of information has really enabled people, and some of it's misinformation, which is dangerous, but I think the general public is far more scientifically literate now than maybe 30 or 40 years ago. And so it enables kind of these more intelligent approaches to asking and to probing these stories and questions and these more compelling ideas of, what it means to be and what kind of advances we expect or what we want to become in the future.
Yeah.
That's been cool to watch.
Yeah. And without attempting to get too political on an issue that I feel like really shouldn't be, but what is your perspective on things like vaccines and whatnot? Like,
yeah,
obviously, it's a thing that I feel like can be kind of interesting because, yeah, it's very good to question science and look into things and learn more for yourself and not just take someone's word for it. But obviously, when you have things like misinformation, it can become very easy to read and get a false understanding of a topic that can then result in you thinking, okay, I know how this works, when you're operating on some fundamental problems.
The misinformation is the problem. You can't get mad at someone for caring about their kid, and you can't get mad at someone for not wanting to hurt them and for being concerned about putting these external factors into them. The incredible weight and body of evidence is, conclusive that vaccines are good.
Yeah.
That have saved countless human lives. They continue to do so, and they have alleviated a level of suffering that people accepted 100 years ago. The problem is when your care for your child and your investment in your child's well-being and that emotion clouds your ability to see that reality. And there's some bad players out there spreading that misinformation. There's some very misinformed players spreading that misinformation. But the real issue is that the bullshit takes like 1,000,000 times more effort to refute than it does to generate. That's not an excuse, because if you're a scientific communicator, if you're someone who works in the field of vaccines or has a vested interest in that, it is your responsibility to address that misinformation and to make sure that the right information is out there. And I saw a really interesting, back on my earlier question of what do you think's done it well lately, I saw a really interesting documentary on flat earthers. Me and Emily went into thinking it was going to mock them the whole time, but it actually, approached the problem very maturely, I thought, because
on Netflix or
yeah, I think it's Ahead of the Curve or Behind the Curve. Yeah, it's one of those. Something.
Yeah, there's not too many on Netflix, so you'll probably find it.
It was very good, and it falls into this category of how do we address it when people will not, take no for an answer, when people will not accept, what is factually true, and what kind of responsibility do we have in those situations? And I think that we do have a lot. And we have a responsibility not to discredit or to mock, but to, just keep pounding away with the evidence, because at the end of the day, that's all you can do. And that's the most healthy and I think the most productive approach.
Yeah. What are some questions you can ask when you find something and feel like you kind of have that feeling of, I don't know if this is true or not, or I feel like there might be more to this story. How can you parse the truth?
Yeah, the easiest way, obviously, is multiple sources. Give weight to trusted sources that have proven themselves to be trustworthy. And then as much as you can research and reach out to people and sources you trust, maybe even people and sources you don't trust, just to get those perspectives. The broader a perspective you can get on the topic, and the more you can get an idea of the field, what experts are saying on the field, because there is a certain weight we should give to authority and people who know what they're talking about. Obviously not supreme weight, but significant weight. Finding multiple avenues of approaching that question is far and away the most helpful if it's something you're uncertain about. Broadening your understanding and getting a good foundation is much better than running down the first pathway you find. That's not really going to get you to the right answer most times.
Yeah. Where do you go when you've got questions about just when you're unsure?
Unsure, it depends on what topic.
Yeah.
It's different if it's like something in the sciences versus something, in philosophy versus something
Let's
in relationships.
Go first with the easily Googleable, I suppose. So when you've got a question that you feel like can be found online, do you just Google it like, say, many programmers do, or people in an IT field or what have you? Do you find that a lot of that information is available online from trusted sources?
Yeah, most of the stuff these days that I have questions on is pretty particular to chemical biology, and so there's a lot of really trustworthy sources I can find on that. And science, I think, does a pretty good job of letting the cream rise to the top and really valuing bodies of evidence and compelling and convincing stories. So it kind of by nature, the good stuff is out there.
Yeah.
It gets a little more dicey in like the political spectrum, obviously, where you have a lot of really intelligent people who are on polar opposite sides of things. And that doesn't happen very much in something big science. It happens, but not for the big stuff. But obviously for politics, it's much more difficult. For that, it's oh boy, I don't know how deep we want to go on that route. But yeah, I rely pretty heavily on Google, like the good millennial I am. I do a fair bit of reading. I've gotten more into reading these days. I think that's important. But just having as informed of a worldview as you can get. And here's my main point. I am immediately skeptical of anyone who communicates certainty. I think there are very few things you should ever be certain about. I know I communicated certainty about vaccines. We're pretty certain about that one.
Yeah.
That's an exception to the rule. But when someone is so certain and so landlocked into an idea that it's clear they've stopped considering outside perspective, that person is no longer worth your time listening to. Because if they're not going to give an outside perspective the time of day, you shouldn't give that the time of day either. And so that's one of the big red flags for me is when there's like an echo chamber, or when there's this idea of this is it. We are right about everything.
Yeah.
Get out. Right about everything. Very few people are right about anything. If history has taught us one thing, it's that. So that's one of the big red flags for me, and that's always something that's helpful in kind of probing new topics or things I'm unsure about.
Yeah, that's yeah, it's a really good piece of advice. I feel like, yeah, just watch out for the people who are spouting
Yeah.
absolute certainty.
If someone is an authority on everything, run away.
Yeah, yeah. And then I feel like pharmacology can be it's a tricky industry because not very many people understand the behind the scenes and what really goes on and whatnot. And so how I yeah so how has things like Theranos, for example, affected your field?
How is it what?
Affected your field or affected how you guys approach and for those who don't know about Theranos,
Yeah.
maybe,
So
maybe
so
you could explain it a
Theranos,
little better than me.
yeah, the long or the short with Theranos was I think it combined the worst of scientific innovation with the worst of Silicon Valley, where someone got so I mentioned certainty earlier. Someone got so certain and so passionate about a project that they could not see the red flags in their scientific design. I mentioned you want to fail early and fail often. You want to ask the hard questions first, so that if your experiment can't answer those hard questions, you ditch it. What Holmes did with Theranos was she avoided those hard questions. She shorted those hard questions because she believed in what she was doing so much that she couldn't see, the writing on the wall. And the problem with the way Silicon Valley and investors handled that was they saw that excitement and they saw those buzzwords and the way it was packaged, and they saw this new next big thing and they wanted to be in on that. And they didn't do the field work and the groundwork that was really crucial to understanding why that project was never going to work. They didn't ask the right questions. So I think hopefully, and I've started to notice this a little bit, I think the biggest effect it'll have, and we might need a few more because I've seen some shoddy investment work, but is changing the way that VCs interact with like biotech startups and with biotech ventures. You have to sell your science sometimes. You have to find an idea that works, and if it's going to have market pay, you got to find a way to get investors and to get that into a product and to get that into a drug market or something like that. And people have leveraged bad science to kind of fool VCs who aren't scientists into backing projects that do not have any potential. And Theranos is a pretty big example of that, but it happens a lot on much smaller scales. And so I think there needs to kind of be a rethinking of how VC and science should interact. There seems to be a little bit of a cooling right now and a slowing down and an understanding that this money isn't going to be endless and unlimited. We have to start putting this into projects that actually work and make sense. And I say this kind of self-centeredly because one of the things I'm seriously considering for a postgraduate career is going into something like a VC and being a scientific advisor on those panels. And looking at the science on the projects they're looking at and being able to say, like, this is not worth your time, or this is solid. Those are really important questions to ask that in the past haven't been asked very well. So hopefully things like Theranos and these failures catalyze that. I think humans learn pretty well from failure, especially venture capitalists.
Yeah.
So hopefully that starts to catalyze a change there.
Yeah, it's crazy. Yeah, definitely. Things always get a little more complicated whenever there's large sums of money involved.
Yeah, and big egos too.
Yeah.
Yeah, things get pretty messy.
Yeah. So what are some things that you'd say people should keep an eye out for, whether it's projects or drugs, whether things are as big as a CRISPR or maybe smaller.
CRISPR, obviously, you're gonna keep seeing headlines about CRISPR until you die. Maybe you'll never die.
Yeah.
It's CRISPR. You're gonna die. If someone says you're not gonna die, you're gonna die. I think the intersection between kind of computation I know people are getting pretty tired of AI and machine learning as buzzwords, but those are important. And those concepts and the way they interface with the scientific process and the way that those will inform and develop and transform the way we do science going forward, that will be a really kind of compelling narrative, I think, and a compelling story to watch. You're going to see a lot of ways that computers handle problems alongside humans that enable humans to discover and to change in ways that weren't possible before. And I think some of the really cool stories are going to come out of that.
Yeah, that's cool. That's cool.
And there's already pretty cool stuff on like the huge like deep learning algorithms that Google's trying to develop and IBM's trying to develop. They're applying that to things like human disease, and all of a sudden you can take a polypeptide, which is an unfolded protein, and from completely naive conditions predict using these models how it's going to fold. And it works pretty well for some polypeptides, which is saying something because no human would ever be able to do that. But if you're able to accurately predict structure just from a protein sequence, that's like a CRISPR level of innovation, because now you, instead of having to grab these structures before you can start to probe the chemical space around these proteins, now the computer can give it to you. That's saving you maybe a year or two of work. You're really jumping into that project quickly. And so that'd be nice, because one of the things I'm doing in my own project right now is trying to find a malarial homologue for this human protein, and to kind of predict what the structure of the malarial homologue looks like from the human one that's similar. And even that process is mind-bogglingly complex. It's really hard to wrap my mind around. Having a computer do that for me would be ideal.
yeah, that sounds like it. Speaking of malaria, I'm curious, are there any what's the work like now when it comes to the eradication of different diseases and what have you? Because many people know like polio was eradicated, and that was a pretty huge milestone in human history, I feel like. But how come we haven't been seeing, I guess as simply, more things be eradicated like that?
Yeah, I think polio and smallpox really lent themselves to eradication campaigns. They were, for the most part, single causative agents of disease that vaccines were very effective towards. We've had much bigger issues eradicating things that you can't vaccinate for. So I might be speaking out of my depth here. I don't think you can vaccinate for TB, which is why that's particularly difficult. You certainly can't vaccinate for malaria, for all of it. And one of the big problems is latency and multiplicity of infective agents. So with something like malaria, you're dealing with not one single disease-causing pathogen, but in humans you have 5, and several strains of each of those 5. And within those several strains of each of those 5, you have several stages of each parasite life cycle, because a parasite's a living thing, it's changing and growing. In each of these stages of different life cycle, it's going to look different to your immune system. So instead of your immune system being primed to recognize and to attack the smallpox virus or the polio virus, all of a sudden you have to train it to recognize and attack 10 different types of malaria for 5 different malarial parasites. And what that is an impossible task. And so vaccines might play a role in the malaria eradication campaign, and there's some cool work going into that. But at the end of the day, what it kind of comes down to is treatment and prevention outside of the vaccine space, which is far more difficult. And that's why, for something like malaria, we're kind of hitting a wall on our ability to really address the problem, because you're kind of limited by the number of chemical agents that are truly effective for treating and curing the disease. And you're also really limited by the socioeconomic status of the places you're treating in. You're basically dependent on cheap things like mosquito nets and really cheap small molecule drugs. Those are your options. You might be familiar, there are drugs called biologics. They're not small molecules. Instead, they're like bigger proteins or antibodies, and they take up a pretty big share of like the American market space because we can afford them and pay for them. Never use a biologic for something like malaria, because if your biologic costs $300 for a single infusion, that you're out of the game. I mean, you have to get that thing below like $30 a dose.
Yeah.
You're never at that scale. So there are those kind of realities for treating malaria. where you're really limited in your options. And certainly there's been some significant progress, and I'm optimistic, obviously, because I'm working on it, that within the next 30 years, it will be eradicated. There's a significant amount of work to go into that. I don't want to say we've picked the low-hanging fruit with smallpox and polio, but I think a really simple answer would be to say that we've picked the low-hanging fruit. The rest of it's hard to reach.
Yeah. It's tricky. What are some problems you see in news coverage of certain diseases and stuff? Because you'll see things like Ebola pop up or whatnot, and it can be so easy to sensationalize some of these things. And I mean, when there are people dying, it is not good. It's bad.
Yeah.
But also, that doesn't necessarily mean that there's an immediate fear of, everyone needs to go and get checked out.
Yeah. Yeah, you kind of put it great, where these things get sensationalized to a point that it's not helpful. I think anyone doing Ebola research is very thankful that it's very much in the national consciousness, because there's obviously a lot of interest and a lot of money going into that. But when we sensationalize it to the point that, like, we're making movies about it and we're terrified of it at the Houston airport, there are things that are more worth our time and our concern back home even. And I think some of that energy could be better spent on, like, how do we encourage Americans to eat better? Sorry, I think my message is going off here. But yeah, the sensationalization is a little concerning sometimes, and it kind of clouds the real conversation and the real human tragedies that occur in these disease endemic countries. I think we cloud them when we. I don't know if I'm misremembering, but isn't there like an Ebola movie coming out?
It honestly wouldn't surprise me. I'm not sure.
Yeah. This isn't entertainment. This is a disease. Yeah.
Yeah, that's crazy. I was gonna say, speaking of entertainment, but I'm kind of a bit of a jump, but
nice segue, yeah.
I'm curious. I'm always interested in some of the forms of entertainment that some of our guests I don't consume or whatnot, or as a child, and how that might have informed their career choices, or sometimes totally not. But I'm curious, what were some of your favorite movies or books? And
how far back do you want me to go?
Let's start as a kid.
As a kid,
gaming,
it's funny. Did you ever read Alex Rider?
Yes, you recommended them to me, actually.
Yeah, I'm rereading them all right now, just taking a trip down memory lane.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. It's fun because stuff like that. I don't know.
There's the mosquito villain, the guy who was.
But there's stuff like that where sometimes it's just nice to have fun and escape in that way. Obviously, you and I both know I always loved video games growing up. It was kind of an escape like that, something you could interact with and have a story and a narrative that takes 10 hours that you're the hero of something. Yeah. Sometimes that's rewarding. And I also, when I got deeper into college, I started really liking things that kind of challenged the way I thought about the world and challenged my worldview. So I mentioned I really like Vonnegut as an author, but I also read a lot of like C.S. Lewis, more in line with my worldview, and a lot of like Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And I'm not going to like list off 100 authors, but reading was another thing that I really enjoyed, and it's valuable to think about the world in that way, I think.
Yeah.
And on a much lower level, I just love playing hockey all the time. I don't think it changes the way I think about the world, but I just like shooting the puck at the net.
Yeah.
So that's fun. And then lately, I'm going to take a class soon on creative writing. That's something I've kind of wanted to get into.
Nice.
Always liked just dabbling in that, but I'm going to start kind of getting more serious about it as we go forward. So.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's really cool. And are there any books you'd recommend to people who either are curious in that field or just as a blanket recommendation of things that impacted you? Or...
It's not a book, it's a blog, but I mentioned it to you. in my book, it's basically the chemical biologist Bible. It's called the In the Pipeline blog by Derek Lowe. And the guy is a very good writer, a very good science communicator. And what he does is each weekday, he just touches on a topic that's on his mind. But he's crazy informed and he's super well spoken. And he's able to take these like current breaking events and things like chemistry, drug development, and science, and really put them again down on a level that's understandable for someone from a general audience, but still really informative for someone within the industry, which is again is crazy valuable.
Yeah. And everything's linked so nicely, which is awesome.
Yeah, I'd recommend that to anyone, even if you're just like curious about something in chemical biology. Like if you hear about phage display, sometimes what I'll do is I'll do phage display in the pipeline. Click. There's like 3 articles he's written on it, and it gives you a really good, just basic understanding of what's going on and where that might be going and what kind of things you might be wanting to think about it.
Yeah.
So I'd recommend that pretty heavily. Yeah.
Yeah. Are there any practices you found that you found to be beneficial towards your work? Because I mean, it's pretty heavily. Well, it's not easy work, I suppose. Would be one.
First year of grad school was challenging.
Yeah.
I'll say that. You have to balance your life.
Mm-hmm.
Even the things you love to do, you will get burnt out on. So you have to have a delineation between time I'm spending doing this, the thing I like to do, and time I'm spending away from this, not thinking about this. And that's going to look different for other people. And I think sometimes that can drive people. Like if you're the kind of person that is not going to enjoy, putting the extra 2 hours in at the end of the day, while your buddy might enjoy that, he might be getting fed from that. And if you're spending yourself doing that, you're going to end up in very different places a year down the road. You have to take the things that work right for you. So get your work done, but do the things that are helping you relax and are helping you get out of that space and are building other aspects of your character in your life that you might not be building through that one thing, even if you like to do it. So for me, that's looked like, I mentioned reading. I've been playing the piano a lot too, and obviously me and Emily hang out a lot, which is very helpful. Getting out in the sun. Labs don't have very much of that.
Yes.
So
I mean, they have heat lamps, right, and stuff.
Yeah, just a heat lamp over my desk. I've noticed, honestly, that's strangely like important. I went out in the sun like a few weekends ago, and on like the end of the day Sunday, I was like, why do I feel so good?
Yeah, it's like, really bizarre.
Yeah, I actually got like vitamin D, and I like breathed fresh air for a while. So imagine that. But yeah, just being cognizant of what your body's telling you, and finding time for hobbies and for relationships.
Mm-hmm. And then you touched on it a little bit, but it's a question that I always like to ask, because even though it might not seem like the most creative focused field, but everyone has different answers. So I'm curious, who are some creative influences of yours, or people that you'd recommend checking out, or other people checking out? So Derek Lowe is one.
Certainly Derek Lowe is one. A lot of them are just my peers, honestly. Mm-hmm. It's really valuable to have people who are in the same arena as you, and to see the way they think about and handle their science and their development is really informative. So for anyone, I think the easiest answer is to look in your network of peers and look in people who you're thinking are doing it the right way, and to really see what aspects of that you want to emulate yourself. But there's also, there's just really interesting writers all over the place. A lot of professors at UCSF that have been helpful. I guess kind of specific to my own network at that point. But yeah, my biggest recommendation would be to find peers that you think are doing it the right way, and to follow their lead. Like I've really appreciated the way you've thrown yourself at the ventures that you do. I think you kind of display a passion for it that is lacking in a lot of the things people do. I think the success will certainly follow. So that's something I respect about the way you've approached your endeavors, and something I've tried to emulate as well.
Thank you. Yeah. Thanks. And to kind of wrap it up and end on, I guess bit more of a positive note. Not that that wasn't, but what are some things that you're really excited about? Maybe they are a little bit more pie in the sky dreams, but things that you hope, fingers crossed, that science might be able to accomplish in our future.
Yeah, I'd like to eradicate malaria. Yeah. I'd like to have a part in that campaign. I think that would be incredibly valuable to get an understanding of, and obviously the human impact is very compelling. So being on the project I'm on, I talked about it briefly, but it's what I'm doing is probing some malarial pathways for potential therapeutic development, and if that has any sort of return and has any sort of contribution to the space of eradicating the disease, that would be worth it very much for me.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, that's really cool. Well, thank you so much, man, for coming on and answering a few of my questions.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. Anytime.
Yeah, totally. And is there anywhere people can find you or anything that you can redirect people to related to that field? Yes, sweet.
I've been starting to write a little bit on Medium, so if you're really into niche Christian poetry, go ahead and follow Matthew Klope on Medium. If not, just stay away.
No, that's awesome. Yeah. Well, thank you so much, man. And I mean, we'll definitely have to have you back on in the future.
Anytime, man.
As I try and get a little more informed in this field that is so broad and vast.
Hey, nobody can fault you for trying, right?
Yeah. It's cool. Well, thanks again, man. And yeah, everyone listening, hope you guys all have a wonderful rest of your day. Do your part, eradicate malaria.
Wear your nets.
All right. See you guys later.